Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salam, hello, peace to you all, and welcome to, I think it's the 11th Office Hours, our weekly live stream program, usually with guests, sometimes on my own, but always a great conversation where we have interaction with you, the listeners and watchers. Something very special to me is the community that's being created here. You know, if you can, if you're on, like the stream so that it gets on to other people's feeds. Perhaps you can share the link to this live stream on your social media accounts. Make sure your friends, comrades, relatives, enemies, they all need to know. This is going to be an important conversation. And even people who may not agree, they might be persuaded by the knowledge and analysis that you all share and that our guest is going to bring. And so without too much further ado, other than to say, besides sharing the stream and subscribing to the channel, if you want to support this public educational project, you can with our gratitude. I'd rather you give to people suffering in Gaza or other great causes. But if you have extra and you want to support this, you can always go to patreon.com/Adnan Husain or make a one-time contribution, buymeacoffee.com/Adnan Husain. But whatever you do, promote this. Don't be stingy with a good thing. This knowledge is there for everyone. So make sure people hear about it. I have a really great guest today. He's a multiple time guest on the podcast Guerrilla History that I co-host with Henry Hakamaki. About his wonderful book, History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, and an episode that was about the Capitalocene. We may touch upon material and topics that are covered in those, but you can always also go back and listen to those episodes. But I'm really delighted to welcome Jason W. Moore to the program. He is teaches world history at Binghamton University, SUNY-Binghamton University, where he coordinates the World Ecology Research Collective. And he's published numerous books, including, as I said, with Raj Patel, A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, earlier Capitalism in the Web of Life, and recent books in several different languages. So I'm not going to butcher the pronunciations, but suffice it to say that they're about world ecology and capitalism. Some of them may be translations of his work of the past into these other languages. And in fact, his work has been translated because it's so important, valuable, and really, frankly, indispensable if you want to think about understanding capitalism and world ecology. It's been translated into many, many different languages. And in addition, he's won many awards, including the Byers and Bernstein Prize in Agrarian Studies, the Braverman Prize in Labor Studies, and the Emanuel Wallerstein Award. And of course, listeners, if you've been on this channel at all, you know that Emanuel Wallerstein is, somebody who helped establish world systems theory. So you can see the range of fields that his work touches upon, and hopefully we'll have a discussion that ranges across many of these topics. Your questions, welcome, put them into the chat. But Jason, comrade, it's so great to have you on. I'm delighted.
I am psyched to be here, Adnan. You've been crushing it lately, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Awesome. And I love also the kind of like sports language, crushing it. We are involved in maybe we would have to say kind of educational martial arts, like political educational martial arts. We're, trying to combat all the bad ideas that are out there. And that's something that your work does so effectively, because among the biggest bad ideas that seems to predominate and the discourses that really affect our political dialogue and discussion, particularly across the West, but really in global institutions, has a lot to do with a certain approach to environmentalism. And you suggested environmentalism of the rich, something that you've written about and characterized. Would be a great kind of topic or launching point for thinking about world ecology and the politics of it in our contemporary age. What is environmentalism of the rich?
It's a great question. The phrase itself comes from Joan Martinez Allier, one of the founders of ecological economics. And many people are more familiar with his phrase, the environmentalism of the poor. Now, Martinez Allier is a deeply problematic thinker, to say the least. He's a self-described neo-Malthusian anarchist. And so everybody in the sort of woke, critical, academic left adopted environmentalism of the poor, which is a garbage concept that just simply is cheerleading for anything that looks remotely environmental and is done by poor folks around the world. Okay, fine, but that's not really much of an idea. However, at one point he described the environmentalism of the rich as run out of the UN environmental institutions that were like the IMF of global planetary management. And that was a provocative idea. Now, he never followed this up. Well, it turns out that once we start looking at environmentalism and what underpins it, naturalism and natural law thinking, that goes back to the origins of capitalism. This goes back to Descartes. It goes back to John Locke and the formulation of civilized and savagery based on bourgeois improvement and capitalist property relations. It has a very, very long history. And once we start digging into this, we understand that the environmentalism of the rich isn't just a polemic or a soundbite. It's that. But it runs much, much deeper. And here's a basic pattern that emerges time and again, even before Malthus at the end of the 18th century, that every time the bourgeoisie is threatened by peasant revolt, proletarian revolt, anti-imperialist revolt, often and increasingly articulated with each other, the bourgeoisie returns to nature. Nature with the uppercase N. Nature, as I've said many times, is the most dangerous conceptual word in the language. It is a ruling idea, a ruling abstraction that drips with blood and dirt, as Marx would say. And for good reason, labor movements and socialist movements were always deeply, deeply skeptical and hostile to arguments coming from natural law. From John Locke to Malthus, to the eugenics movement, to environmentalism in the 1960s. Time and time again, when does naturalist thinking come up? It comes up when the imperial bourgeoisie is challenged by labor unrest, anti-colonial unrest. The eco-socialist left has refused to look at this history. And in fact, they've denounced this history without the slightest interest in looking into it. It's very, very important that we understand what we today can call the environmentalism of the rich in its modern form emerges in the 1960s. Its birth is really somewhere between 1968, when Paul Ehrlich writes The Population Bomb, when Garrett Hardin, not a Nazi, but kind of a couple doors down from the Nazis. I'm not kidding. A well-known eugenicist, Garrett Hardin, who wrote the most influential environmentalist article ever, The Tragedy of the Commons, of course, completely fact-free. And that set in motion that expressed rather what the foundations in the United States had already turned to, Ford Foundation especially, but the Rockefellers as always were in there, smaller but more politically influential. And almost overnight between 68 and 70, when you have the first Earth Day, of course, at the high point of the world revolution of 1968, the high point of the anti-imperialist and labor struggles within the imperial West, that there is a turn towards environmentalism by the ruling classes and the foundations in particular. Almost overnight, for instance, the Ford Foundation puts into business the Environmental Defense Fund, the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, and the Natural Resources Defense Council. That's not the end of the story, but that gives you a sense of the massive push. This was very much the second wave of the Ford Foundation bringing the cultural Cold War home. The first phase had been the turn towards black capitalism, starting in 1964, of course, in response to the civil rights struggles, and then a series of long, hot summers, the urban insurrections over this period. This is the soft power apparatus of imperial control. And the story doesn't end there. And we can get into the contemporary ramifications of this, which are absolutely horrifying. Like if we look at what well-known climate scientists like Johan Rockström are doing, he pals around every year or almost every year with the folks at Davos. He's associated with some of the absolutely worst, most elite, most repressive environmental NGOs like Conservation International. But if we go back to the kind of familiar face of the environmentalism of the rich, we have to go back to 1968, 1970, and then building up to the first Stockholm, the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm in 1972. And there's a lot of interesting things we can say about this, but one of them is that it's financed by an oil man, Robert Anderson, of ARCO, Atlantic Richfield. It is organized by an oil executive, a Canadian oil executive, Maurice Strong, who also ran, and this is important, Canada's development agency in the mid-1960s, and had been around the Rockefellers since he was a teenager. And it gets more interesting than that. Robert Anderson finances it. Strong organizes it through something called the Aspen Institute, which is still around to this day. The Aspen Institute is essentially one of the key NGO faces of the foreign policy establishment and the CIA. This remains true to this day. Anyone curious can go and look at Aspen Institute and their gatherings, and they're full of people like Condoleezza Rice and other evil wretches. So, and this was part of this organizing of a global environmentalism of the rich, was absolutely part of the imperial bourgeoisie, especially the Trilateralist Commission, which forms just a little bit later, but key figures are involved in Stockholm, like Richard Gardner, the U.S. diplomat. And what we see is that Stockholm appears, the Stockholm Conference appears in 1972, precisely in response to Third World Revolt, and especially the brewing, if ultimately impotent, challenge of the new international economic order. Everybody forgets about this. No eco-socialist will talk about it. And that in itself poses a series of interesting intellectual and political questions about in my view, the underlying neo-Malthusianism of, let's say conservatively, 80% of eco-socialists.
Okay, this is really fascinating. I think we should talk a little bit more about neo-Malthusianism and how to identify it, what's the sort of like basis of it, and why it is often yoked to progressive discourse and language. And perhaps we'll have a chance to go, talk a little bit more about some of the mechanisms of the ways it's expressing itself and damaging, real solutions politically, since the creation of Earth Day, and as you were saying, as you're identifying, late 60s kind of conscious effort to derail the new left and the old left. And I just want to pause here, before I give you a chance to kind of talk a little bit more about, the neo-Malthusianism and the way it kind of influences, environmentalist discourses, social policy, etc., is just to remind people that they could read and should read, if they haven't already had a chance to, your very interesting article in the Baffler that kind of, gives a kind of broad overview of this era and its consequences for, climate movement, environmentalism today, called The Fear and the Fix. Environmentalism Serves the Powerful. People should check that out. And there's a lot of what you've been just describing discussed in some detail there. So, why don't you kind kind of take us through a little bit of that the neo-Malthusianism that's at the heart of this kind of bizarrely, this kind of progressive, well, it's the same way in some sense that the way eugenics was often seen, yoked to progressive social policy as well. Like, you think of who Margaret Sanger really was, or like discourses on women's sort of health and abortion yoked to eugenics, right? So you could have something that is about personal freedom, but it's part of a politics of, some kind of far right kind of geneticist idea. So anyway, yeah, tell us a little bit
That's
more.
absolutely right.
Malthus.
So first, let's be clear about what Malthus was doing. And most people say, "Oh, Malthus, he was the population guy." First of all, as Marx understood very well, Malthus was a complete idiot, and anyone who spent any time at all reading Malthus encounters a completely incoherent thinker who knew nothing about actual population in late 18th century England. Malthus was fundamentally using a set of natural law arguments to justify social inequality, class inequality, at a moment when class inequality had dramatically widened in England between 1750 and the end of the century. That's one part of it. Malthus is also writing in the 1790s, arguably, in fact, I don't even think arguably, the most rebellious and contentious decade of capitalist history to this point. This is the French Revolution and its radical turn. This is the Haitian Revolution. This is a series of popular revolts across the Atlantic world. This is the emergence of a kind of Spencean proto-socialism in England. Maybe some people know about the moral economy of food riots. Semi-proletarians in the countryside are seizing grain shipments. There is tremendous ferment within England. And, oh, by the way, Ireland revolts the year that Malthus published the first essay, 1798. And in those years, right around those years, I believe beginning in 1797, key sections of the English fleet mutiny. So this is a crisis moment for the British ruling class. So what do we see? As I just mentioned before, we see a return to nature. We see a return to natural law. It wasn't about population. Now, it did have impact on actually existing populations. So Malthus is employed very, very soon in the early 19th century by the East India Company's College. He is the first chair in political economy at the East India Company's College. So to call Malthus and Malthusianism fundamentally imperialist, that's an empirical claim. That's not a polemic. And to call people who endorse Malthus and neo-Malthusianism, which I'll get to in a moment, that's as apologists for imperialism, that's just factual. I don't know what else you want to call it. And of course, what Malthus was doing was teaching or indoctrinating several generations of cadre for the East India Company who would go on to circulate around the empire, including in India. And the impacts, as Mike Davis shows in Late Victorian Holocaust, were mind-boggling. I mean, mass murders beyond anything that we saw in World War II in terms of sheer numbers. These late Victorian Holocaust, tens of millions of South Asians die under British rule in the late 19th century at the same time as the British are taking food out of the subcontinent. This is directly laid at the doorstep of Malthus. And eugenics is part of this. So eugenics is another Malthusian moment that, again, relates to what I call good science. This was the good science of the moment. And we've had other moments of good science after. What happens in the 1930s and then robustly in the 1940s, coincident with the American reconstruction of the capitalist world, is something called environmental neo-Malthusianism. And it's a mouthful. I don't know if there's any way to get around it. But this is the neo-Malthusian environmental sensibility associated with ecological footprint, carbon footprint, and all of this garbage. It is, here's a carrying capacity, here's the population. And that was developed very, very quickly after World War II, in part through the American Empire's bankrolling of demography as a science, in which they hired Frederick Osborne, one of the authors of these key texts after World War II. I believe The Road to Survival, but there are two. One's called Our Plundered Planet. I think that was Osborne's, and then Road to Survival by a fellow named Voigt. Osborne was a big eugenicist. It was an officer of the American Eugenics Society, and was the first director of the Rockefeller-financed Population Studies Center. I forget what it was called. Coincident with, of course, Princeton's Office of Population Research. So when people talk about population science, they are talking about a good science, in a term that should send chills down our spines. They're talking about a good science entirely bankrolled by the American Empire and its foundations, like the Rockefellers. The Rockefellers had their hands in everything. They were in China in the 30s. They send Norman Borlaug, who later wins the Nobel Peace Prize for the Green Revolution. Don't get me started on that. Sends him to Mexico in the 40s. And then they're busy building up this demographic, environmental infrastructure that finally comes into fruition in the 1960s in a popular way. So for the first time, I mean, environmentalism had always been around. It had always been elite. It never had a mass base. And only after 68, with Paul Ehrlich, who's always on Johnny Carson, and you couldn't open a magazine in 1968, 69 without seeing Paul Ehrlich. There's this massive coordinated media push to basically prime the popular pump for the first Earth Day. And there, the familiar tropes of our times were on offer. Too many people as the cause of the world's problems. Planetary management was needed. Today, people say stewardship. Same thing. Planetary management was necessary. We needed to embrace personal lifestyle politics and live cleanly. Ride your bicycle to work and all that. I mean, of course, I'm in favor of riding a bicycle to work if that's safe and a good thing to do, but not as a politics. And so this idea of humans overwhelming the great forces of nature, that's a slogan from the Anthropocenists, who are all neo-Malthusians and who have to be neo-Malthusians because it's man against nature. And that's the kind of Malthusianism we get today, this man versus nature overpopulation. Only there's an interesting wrinkle that happened in the 1990s. The people arguing that overpopulation was the source of the problem had two basic popular sources of popular resistance. One was that empirically fertility rates have been falling since 1971. And the other is that overpopulation was, of course, always the overpopulation of poor brown people around the world. So what did they do? They did something very, very, very tricky that has bamboozled most of the left, including most environmental social scientists. They said, well, the problem is consumption. The problem is consumption. That is rebranded neo-Malthusianism. And if you think about it carefully, of course, in the neoliberal era, the vast majority of humankind were subject to what Farshad Araghi calls forced underconsumption. So that's one, there's a moral dimension of it just at that level. But also that makes the politics of environmentalism necessarily austerity politics. And those are, as we know, you don't have to be a master of economic history to understand the extraordinary violence that went along with all forms of austerity over the past 50 years.
Yes, indeed. So there's a kind of environmental austerity politics. So, there's, of course, the neoliberal social austerity politics, which is we can't afford all of these social programs, that are so costly, and we have an aging population and a declining workforce, so it's insupportable. We got to take your Social Security. There's a crisis, so there's kind of the free market, globalization, and its consequences for social programs, kind of austerity. But you're arguing that there is, in fact, actually also this deep vein of environmental austerity that is an expression of this neo-Malthusian kind of idea that consumption is insupportable on the planet. And, actually, I do have a question here. I've seen also a lot of people who are in what we would think of as radical left environmental and social policy, also talking about degrowth, being anti-growth, because I guess it's a similar kind of idea. Maybe it's less tied very specifically to consumption, though sometimes it is, but just the idea that an economy built around growth, and they particularly make this a kind of critique of capitalism, that capitalism has this endless, ceaseless need for growth, by the logic of accumulation, and we have to turn away from that. But some of the way in which they frame it is the kind of sense that we have to kind of collapse, or at least constrain and reduce consumption and pollution and so forth, which are natural outcomes of growth. Do you have a kind of I saw a great exchange a year ago between Jason Hickel and somebody who was arguing that you have to, turn away from growth. And that wasn't Jason Hickel's position. And I'm wondering, how you would intervene in this kind of, to parse out, what's behind this question and how we should really think about that.
Well, Jason Hickel is an outlier, and in no way represents the main line of degrowth politics. Now, when we say degrowth, there's a slogan. And I'm not sure that that's always the same as degrowth as a politics.
Mm-hmm.
About degrowth as a politics is not labor-centered. It's centered on a fetish. Because, as you just indicated, some link growth to capital accumulation. And then if you do that, then you have to link it to class struggle. Mm-hmm. And imperialism, and all of the fundamental Marxist critique. The originators of degrowth were people like Andre Gors, who I see as a right-wing socialist, very anti-working class, thought that the working class was totally bought off by capitalism. This was a fashionable new left idea. Again, very much indebted to the cultural milieu of the cultural Cold War. Run by the American foundations and the CIA after World War II. And the legacy goes on and on and on. So I have many comrades who are identified with degrowth, but it's not clear to me that their politics are degrowth. Mm-hmm. That's the end, be all and end all of their categories. Of course, economic growth comes from economic accounting. This is, as Timothy Mitchell tells us in his wonderful histories, really pioneered by John Maynard Keynes, working for the successor to the East India Company, the India Home Office. And then, economic accounting is one of the softwares of American post-war imperialism, right? That was the economic accounting expression of the development project, imperialism by another name. So I'm very skeptical about any politics that begins with a fetish. I think fetish in, fetish out. And I think that as a slogan, it distracts us from the centrality of labor. The climate crisis is a labor crisis. The climate crisis is a class struggle. And if we start with a fetish, it becomes very hard to escape from it, because for capital, growth is not the issue, but accumulation. That's one issue. The other issue is that I think we are now seeing in the world projects that point beyond endless capital accumulation and towards a political accumulation model. And in the imperial West, this is what I've called the new climate consensus that brings together the Davos World Economic Forum set, the major environmental NGOs, the UN environmental program, what I've called an eco-industrial complex. And their project, as I see it, is to resolve the climate crisis through technical fixes and forcing the bottom 80% of the population to pay. Degrowth does not have a response to that. If the imperialist West's ruling classes are able to advance on this project and essentially end growth, which incidentally, from Lenin to Baran and Sweezy to John Bellamy Foster, everybody said capitalism is heading towards secular stagnation, endless stagnation. This is a cornerstone of one important thread of Marxist thinking that is also totally ignored. So this kind of issue is coming up a lot. For instance, everybody was saying, this is Andreas Malm, that China is the smokestack of the world and is, maybe not driving, but and this was 15 years ago, granted, but is really, you can see it's leading the carbonization footprint of late industrial capitalism. Well, as we know, China is hitting both peak CO2 emissions and peak fossil fuel consumption years ahead of what anyone thought. So there are that. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that there are ruling classes in the world that are fully aware of the climate crisis and are developing approaches to that. I think Belt and Road is an approach to that. I think the Davos, Washington, Langley, Pentagon nexus is part of that, as well as is a competing moment of that. That means that if we begin with something other than Marx's categories of labor, class, capital, value, we're going to end up, I think, with revanchist politics. And there's a deep history to this. The whole history of environmentalism, of mass environmentalism since '68, is basically this.
Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on the revanchist component, how it flows into revanchist type projects and what that looks
distance, like. I would say, just the back of the envelope answer is that the distance between liberal environmentalism and eco-fascism is about this far. Let's see if we can get this. It's very, very, very close. And you can look at this historically in the politics of the eco-industrial complex. In the United States, in the belly of the beast, environmentalism never made capital pay. They claim this. They claim credit for all this environmental legislation, which predated predated Earth Day, predated the emergence of anything resembling a modern lobby. It was a very the Clean Air Act of 1970 was very cheap for capital, because whatever changes needed to be made, all of the investments from the post-war expansion were amortized. And then very quickly, American capital farms out industry to overseas. So there's the dominant strains of environmentalism in the 70s, and there are outliers that people want to loop in, like anti-nuclear and consumer protection. That's not environmentalism. They were definitely related. There were definitely an exchange of cadres, but it's a very distinct phenomenon. The main lines were anti-immigration, anti-working class, absolutely anti-working class, and basically a politics of the suburban professional managerial class, not a class, of course, but we know which we mean. And none of this is like just a speculative charge. Here's one of my favorite examples, that the Environmental Defense Fund likes to take credit for the banning of DDT, and which the ruling came down from the EPA administrator in 1970, and it was finally phased out a couple years later. Well, DDT, as we know, was used in agriculture and poisoned the farm workers. The United Farm Workers led labor organizing drives that had that for a short time brought in the Environmental Defense Fund. As soon as the ruling came down from the EPA administrator, the Environmental Defense Fund abandoned the United Farm Workers. Now, that's a problem because the DDT, which was already being phased out, was totally phased out and then replaced with a new brand of herbicides drawn from organophosphates, which are extremely toxic at the point of production, but dissipate. So DDT traveled everywhere. And if you grew up in the 70s, you learned about the bald eagles and the eggshells and all this. So DDT traveled everywhere, including into those suburbs where the professional strata resided. And so they were, once DDT was phased out, they were insulated from that effect. And they could buy the bell peppers or the strawberries at the grocery store where the organophosphate toxicity had dissipated. This comes again and again and again. Whenever there are working class struggles, they are shunted out, they are blocked. Lois Gibbs of Love Canal fame, she a working class housewife who found that her kid's school was built on a toxic waste dump. There's a famous moment where Carter administration officials come and they basically kidnap them, detain them for like 2 days, something that would never be done now. Big Green never had anything to do with Lois Gibbs, who founded the anti-toxics movement in the United States. And of course, Big Green never had anything to do with so-called environmental justice, but the working class, Black working class movement in the South in response, especially in the aftermath of the United Church of Christ 1987 report. So what we see here is a professional class alliance with, at first, the Democratic Party, but then, sort of carving out its space and pursuing the politics of structural adjustment. Most famously, this happens with the debate over the North American Free Trade Agreement, where key sections of the environmentalist movement went over to the free trade Clintonian side and effectively tipped the balance against bipartisan opposition, labor opposition, and the opposition of their own organizations like the Sierra Club, for instance, fiercely opposed at the rank and file level, and tipped the balance for free trade, which is one factor that unleashed the rapid uptick of CO2 emissions, going from about 1%, 1.5% a year rather in the 1980s to about 3% or higher after 1992. Of course, not just free trade, also the overthrow of the Soviet Union. We can go, there's a long list of factors, but the environmentalists were complicit in all of this at every step.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess we have to say that Ralph Nader didn't save the world with it.
But Ralph Nader was not an environmentalist, and some of the things he did actually made capital pay.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the difference, I guess, is really between the eco-industrial complex that you're talking about and genuine consumer advocacy, and people who actually sued companies and forced them to pay for cleanups and things like that. One question that did come in was just a request to maybe clarify and give some greater analytical explanation for eco-fascism, what that is. And I think, given some of the arguments that you've made, and if people should read The Baffler of Fear and The Fix, and some of your other, there's another, I'm actually wondering if this one is in fact out, The Cultures of Fear. And
yep, that is out and up on my website, jasonwmoore.com. It's not clear to me what eco-fascism is exactly, because I think it applies to a lot of different circumstances. Certainly a hallmark would be blood and soil nationalism, which was also the position of liberal environmentalists for a very, very long period of time. Paul Ehrlich co-authors a book in the late 70s called The Golden Door, which the point of which was to say that not open borders, but immigration was bad. Immigrants were even worse for the environment. Because they would come to the U.S. and then consume more.
Right. If they stay in the global South, where they don't have access to, consumer products and can't use so much energy, it's better for the world, right? Than if they become first worlders and profligates like us. Yeah.
Exactly. And it also points to one of the great blind spots of not just liberal environmentalists, but also eco-socialists. None of them want to talk about the forever wars.
Right.
None of them want to talk about at the moment when the Anthropocene became popular. From 2000, you have, according to Tufts University, fully 1/3 of all foreign military interventions ever organized by the United States have occurred since 2000. There's not a word for this in any of the Anthropocene literature, and barely any. It absolutely does not figure, aside from the work of myself and John Antonacci, a student of mine who just wrote a great dissertation and writing articles on endless war and climate crisis and cheap nature. Nobody will touch this on the eco-socialist left. It is, and I suspect because most of the eco-socialist left is writing from the imperialist heartland, and Their eco theory, the eco part of their theory, disables them. Okay, what about eco-fascism? So it's not one or two figures from so-called respectable or liberal environmentalism. It's a lot. Garrett Hardin, famous eugenicist, author of Lifeboat Ethics. So it says it all you need right there. I mean, beware when environmentalists start to use ship metaphors, maritime metaphors. James Lovelock, author of the Gaia Hypothesis, gives an interview. He was in his 90s. He's passed away since. He lived forever, unfortunately. But he gave an interview in the 90s to the Tory Graph saying, we need to spend more money on the British fleet so that they can repel dark-skinned immigrants from Africa. I mean, you have to laugh or cry when I go through all this. This happens again and again and again. In the late 1990s, in 1997, David Brower of the Sierra Club calls immigration the greatest problem in the world today. This is the year of the great Southeast Asian financial crisis, and is absolutely fixated on these anti-worker, anti-immigrant politics that have since been taken up by so-called eco-fascists. But it's the mainstream environmentalists are very soft on this. They denounce the eco-fascists, but in fact, with the eco-fascists, I think that they share an underlying blood and soil view of politics, and I think that is premised in what I call a substance fetishism. That is, you endow substances with supernatural powers, as Marx would say. Just stop oil, for instance. So fascist thinking loves to fetishize and create substances ideologically create substances out of relations instead of course, and the liberals do the same. This is all environmentalism. It is the management of substances. That's what systems dynamics do. That's what all of these planetary management, planetary stewardship schemes, carbon trading, et cetera, et cetera. What are they doing? Why is carbon trading such a joke, or offset carbon markets such a joke? Well, first of all, they're pollution permits, and the second is they take webs of life and turn them into entities that are homologous. They look the same, homologous to capitalist value and the sell form of the commodity. So it wants to turn the world into these kinds of units. This seems to me particularly relevant because the greatest push towards some form of technoscientific authoritarian rule today doesn't come from the eco-fascists. It comes from the centrist liberals. And just look at what Keir Starmer in the UK, Ursula von der Leyen in the EU, discussions of central bank currencies, and how that's linked up to the sustainable development goals and other forms of mapping and surveilling planetary life and turning them into essentially assets.
Yes, I mean, I think that's the point, is that when you said that they're basically like this, and that is because in certain respects they could be very indistinguishable when it comes to the way environmental assumptions about the environment and the social policies,
man, nature, carrying capacity, all of that.
That's right. I mean, it's extremely authoritarian. This kind of PMC orientation is essentially, as you were saying, Timothy Mitchell has studied the genealogies of this rule by experts, right? That, there's a inherent anti-democratic kind of approach to this. So that's why it's a little bit hard to distinguish. I mean, we're typically used to thinking of, climate deniers as people on the right, and so as a result it sometimes masks that there is a kind of eco-fascism going on. There's a crude and a more complex perhaps version of this. The crude version is just saying there is going to be environmental problems and it's going to send environmental refugees to our shores. The kind of Raspai, this I'm forgetting his first name, but he wrote this kind of novel that was kind of a science fiction novel that was essentially about how the West was going to be overwhelmed by, black, brown, and yellow hordes fleeing, environmental devastation. And so that's kind of one crude version of it. But, basically, as you're saying, the authoritarianism and the nationalism that underlies even sort of supposedly liberal versions of it mimics some of the same kinds of, consequences. So that's I think very important for us to recognize and understand. But you had also talked a little bit about. Well, I wanted to actually probe a little bit more about fear and the politics and use of fear, but also, for this kind of authoritarian regime, these apocalyptic discourses being used. But to distinguish between genuine kinds of fear about the fate of the web of life, under continuing devastation, and the more cynical, discursive, apocalyptic use of it for an authoritarian regime that retains or preserves class privilege. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more. How do you distinguish between, what's legitimately the concern, and how to unyoke recognition of that concern for the web of life, of global ecology, and the class interested ways of trying to head off what you really argue is the collapsing of capitalism.
Right, or the transition from capitalism to something else. The collapse, it turns out, and not a criticism at all, because this is in our language now, collapse is itself a neo-Malthusian metaphor. And it comes out of, its genealogy really goes back to neo-Malthusian accounts of the so-called Mayan collapse. And everybody knows this story, which was made into a neo-Malthusian fairy tale. More likely, as we know now, shifting class dynamics have a massive impact on agriculture and the class relations of agriculture, and tend to be moments that are quite inhospitable to ruling classes. So historically, moments of bad climate, to just simplify it crudely, have also been moments of political possibility for the producing classes. This is even true in the history of capitalism. The era of Malthus, for instance, is the era, the last great cold snap of the Little Ice Age, where from 1783, when the Loki Fissure, the volcano in Iceland, explodes, it sends a chill across the northern hemisphere, literally, and was not coincidentally an era of profound revolt. And this is not a one-off. This happens, you can take it all the way back to the Bronze Age crisis. You can take it back to the crisis of the Roman West. And if Marxists don't have a good argument for this, then they're going to cede the terrain to the neo-Malthusians. So this has to come again and again and again. We should also be aware that this use of two major tropes in recent environmental liberal culture: existential threat and climate emergency. Now, it's very clear that the existential threat rhetoric is not taken seriously by the people who say that's a real thing. Because if it was, then they would be raising the alarm about Biden's and now Trump's drive to nuclear war with Russia, which is obviously a much more clear and present danger of nuclear annihilation and existential threat to the web of life. They don't seem to be at all concerned about that. In fact, I would say probably the great majority of them believe that the Ukrainian US-backed, the US NATO-backed war should just continue indefinitely. This is rather horrifying. Never mind saber rattling in the Middle East around nuclear powers, and now, as we know, this is becoming an increasingly live issue as well. So they're not interested in it. They don't really take this existential threat rhetoric very seriously. And indeed, to take it seriously would require that we understand capitalism is essentially immune to, as you said, the devastations of the webs of life that have occurred over the past 500 years. There's an old German expression that robs from Max Weber, that capitalism, unless it is stopped from outside, will continue until the last tree is cut. This is something widely repeated by eco-socialists, and it is absolutely a neo-Malthusian mirage. Capitalism already is morphing into something else. the profound, what I call the ultra centralization of capital, is beyond anything that Baran and Sweezy could have imagined in the 1960s. Just in the US, you have the big three index funds, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, as the largest shareholders in each other, Vanguard accepted. And those three are the largest shareholders in something like the top 1,600 corporations. So the degree, and that's on top of every corporate, every economic sector is dominated by 3 or 4 corporations. I don't know what you call it, but capitalism has to have competition, and I don't see it. And that's not an unorthodox, I mean, that's a kind of unorthodox position, but that was also the position of Baran and Sweezy publishing in 1966. And not that they were right about everything, but the centralization of capital has clearly reached a new stage. And it's not just that they all own each other, but the interlocking directorates between major corporate boards, the intelligence services, and of course, regulatory capture and key agencies of government. That's reached some new stage. I agree with Bob Brenner now. That's a movement towards political accumulation. It's going on in Beijing too, but looks completely different, is done completely different. All right, so we have this doomist rhetoric, and to argue against it is then to be said, well, what, you're saying climate change is a hoax? Well, no, I mean, elite climate politics is absolutely a hoax. The climate crisis is quite serious, and we can map that out very concretely in terms of the accumulation of capital, of agricultural productivity, which we know from Marx, it's agricultural revolutions that are the kind of nexus, the basic condition for capitalist development. That model is now over because of the yield suppression effects of climate change. We can go on down the list, but basically we have reached a degrowth moment. And the degrowth movement, as you mentioned, is, I think, not really able to deal with that very well. Maybe Jason Hickel and a few outliers, but no. And the environmentalists totally don't deal with it. The eco-socialists don't really want to deal with it either. We've reached that secular stagnation. I mean, my one-time comrade, and now he's very unhappy with me, John Bellamy Foster, used to write, well, it's stagnation, stagnation, stagnation. And that's been my argument for over a decade, but still, I must be wrong because I don't agree with this or that element of his program. Nevertheless, that insight has to be taken very seriously. So stagnation means crisis, like epochal crisis for capitalism. And capitalism has always had new frontiers of cheap nature, food, land, energy, raw materials, above all, labor. It all comes down to labor. Because everything else shapes the productivity and cost of labor and the possibility of value creation. That there are no more frontiers for capitalism. So what's the tendency? Well, the tendency is towards political accumulation. You see this with the forever wars. That's a key moment. I mean, post-war Marxists, Michael Kidron, and then journalists like Seymour Melman and others talking about the permanent war economy. That's just become bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And don't get me started on big pharma, and America is the sickest country on the planet and has a medical model that's basically designed to keep people alive and sick and extract value from them, all by political mechanisms, by the way. That's not market competition. So we have this doomist rhetoric that serves an authoritarian move towards what Aldous Huxley called scientific dictatorship. And that's why centrist liberalism is much more of a clear and present danger to our civil liberties, to what remains of liberal democracy, etc. But liberal democracy was always fake democracy, and it always rested on the promise of progress in an uppercase P, because of this underlying stagnation that comes from the end of cheap nature. There's no more progress. There's no more promise of well-being. What's going to replace it? So that was a long build up to the punchline. Yep. What's going to replace it? The fear. Fear, as progress recedes, fear advances. And that's exactly what we've seen. And the greatest way for the ruling classes to mobilize fear is through nature. But it can also be naturalistic imagery, like terrorists as savages, or communists as savages that went together. It doesn't have to just be nature, but nature, something directly naturalized, is so powerful. And the left won't address this. They think nature is a good thing. Nature is not a good thing. It's a very bad thing.
Well, certainly the way we've engaged it and used it politically. I mean, in some ways, nature also naturalizing certain social phenomena is also part of this discursive appeal to nature as part of the crisis recalibrations of the ruling elite. In fact, in some ways, I would say, uh, these are recalibrations not of only the racial regime, as Cedric Robinson would have it, but you're suggesting very fundamentally recalibrations of the environmental or natural regime. And one of the things that happens, it seems, is moving back to naturalizing categories that we thought had been fully socialized, like race, again under these kinds of crude sort of aggressive politics, as there's this breakdown of cheap nature, cheap labor, it's so on, that those horizons are being reduced, and you're seeing political accumulation. I mean, what is Trump's tariff, kind of his bullying, his kind of visits to the Gulf and so on, other than political approaches to accumulation? And I think that's a very interesting and important insight, to see the place both of forever wars and even the critiquers of the forever wars behave in ways, because they can't they can't get away from the only resource being available is political, i.e. military threat, bullying, political bullying, and geopolitics, to be able to accumulate, in this sort of crude sort of way. And it reminds me that we had a comment that reflects on a point that you had made about these forever wars and so on. The U.S. military, of course, being the biggest polluter on the planet, and they know it, and also, of course, the environmental devastation that's caused by these wars, the destruction, the releasing of all kinds of terrible toxins from just think of how horrifically toxified Gaza is, in addition to trying to eliminate and destroy the people, but that the environment is now being toxified by this we saw in Iraq kind of depleted uranium munitions, and so on. It's just on and on, the ways in which it's a crime against the web of life, and yet they're also addicted to this as the only way in which they can have accumulation through the military industrial complex. But there was a question that came up on something that was earlier, and I'm thinking about this kind of question really about the waste of this kind of form of accumulation here in capitalism, when it reaches these stages, which was a question that came from Benji Schoendorf, good colleague and co-host of Resistance is Fertile podcast, which I want to remind listeners was suppressed on this channel, YouTube. We're still hoping, that can be reversed. There's a petition. Maybe, Benji, you can put it into the chat where people can go and protest this to try and restore it to YouTube. But he had a question. He asked, does Jason think China produces use value and the empire produces waste? Referring to something you had mentioned earlier when you were talking about, these critiques of, well, you had mentioned Andreas Malm's kind of like idea that China is this, kind of apex polluter now, and so forth. So he had this question about, does China produce use value and the empire produce waste? And it just reminds me about Ali Kadri's kind of work on the accumulation of waste. I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to note is that capitalism is a history of recurrent genocides and ecocides, and they've been increasingly articulated over the course of the past 5 centuries. We get the modern word ecocide, of course, from the scientific scientists who are against the war denounced Operation Ranch Hand and the ecocide in Vietnam, and the emergence of environmentalism as a movement completely ignored this. That's how, and even worse, when the Sierra Club did get around to denouncing Agent Orange use, they only came out against the use of Agent Orange on the jungles, not on the human beings. Which is just basically sums it up. Like it would be like the Sierra Club saying, well, you know what the Israelis did to Gaza or using depleted uranium in Syria, that was a problem, but not because they killed all the people. That's
neo-Malthusianism. Maybe you have to
exactly.
kill all the people, yeah.
Exactly. I'm not romantic about China and Belt and Road. However, it's clear to me that what is happening is the Communist Party's move towards a more explicit kind of political accumulation that will not suppress markets, but is really going to be a kind of 21st century reinvention of what the great Japanese historian of China, Hamashita, calls the tribute trade system. And of course, the Chinese, pre-modern Chinese empires were deeply and powerfully commercial, had relations all across Asia, South Asia, into East Africa, extraordinarily dynamic. Yes, of course, they were going to make displays of power. They were going to make profit. They were going to make friends that would be good for business. Now, that sounds a lot like Belt and Road. About use, I mean, I get into the nitty gritty with the Marxist philosophy and the relational categories here. I don't think that there's use value separate from value. Does China still have to respond to the law of value on a world scale? That is the dynamics of endless accumulation. Yes, of course. Are they becoming increasingly subject to politics and geopolitical priorities? Yes, of course they are. And hence the ability of China to cooperate across Eurasia to build out the rail network. I mean, that's what the 12-Day War was about, is I mean, crudely speaking, the rail network, the first shipment from the Chinese coast to Apron, the dry port right outside of Tehran, was just a couple weeks before. And obviously there's this like, oh my God, we have to destabilize the Iranian government before we can't. And guess what? It's too late. And China has won. So I'm not saying there aren't problems and contradictions. Of course there are. I'm a Marxist. There are always contradictions. And, I'm influenced by Mao. The transition to socialism is one of a continual and continuous class struggle. So I like that. How much of that is animating Chinese society at this point, I don't know. However, the question about waste is very important. And I've written several essays on this point, but basically capitalism is tremendously wasteful. It requires waste frontiers that are increasingly bigger and bigger as it goes on. But of course, waste frontiers get smaller and smaller. Not only that, Benji, you're totally right. It's increasingly toxic, and the war machine has to come into play more and more. So I said, for every moment of waste in capitalism, there's another imperialist moment of laying waste to peoples and places. And we've seen this from the conquest of the Americas to the genocides in Gaza.
Brilliant. Yes. Wonderful. Ann Lee had asked maybe a niche question for those cognoscenti about Kohei Saito's work. I think she may be referring to things like his article, Rentier Capitalism, Technofascism, and the Destruction of the Common. And she wanted your comment on the overall orientation of his work. I think going back to, because you talked a little bit about the great, I think you mentioned the worst article, a very influential article. The worst article was The Tragedy of the Commons. So, what's going on with this sort of orientation in, socio-ecological thought?
So if Kohei Saito wants to call himself a Marxist, fine. But it's a Marxism without class struggle. It's an argument, and you see this in the recent essay. By the way, Anli, you'll enjoy my response to it, which is coming out very soon in the same journal. It's that Kohei's worldview is a worldview without history. It's a worldview without class struggle. It's a worldview without political, without at least a Marxist political economic dynamic. So in that article, for instance, he says, "Oh, there's still plenty of competition in the world," which is astounding to me. I mean, that's colossally ignorant. There's no imperialism in it. So here's a Marxism without class struggle, without history, without imperialism, without, frankly, much environmental history at all. I mean, this is the thing that cracks me up about these liberal eco-socialists. They're not actually interested in environmental history. Then it doesn't appear very much in their work. You go and read Andreas Malm, John Bellamy Foster, Kohei Saito. There are some people who have done some serious environmental history in this tradition. Hannah Holloman, for instance, on the global dust bowl of the 1930s. So Kohei's article is particularly a travesty because it's dealing with the rise of big tech, and he seems completely unaware of the actual history of big tech, which is a wholly owned project of the American war machine. And I don't mean just Palantir being put into business by the CIA's venture capital firm, In-Q-Tel. I mean, going back to the 1950s, going back to the 1940s. I mean, it all comes out of World War II, Vannevar Bush, and the special projects of the Navy. That's where we get James Forrester and the modern computing industry. James Forrester is also the guy who cooked up the algorithm, or the model rather, for limits to growth. So this all connects. But anyway, the whole history of big tech is one of a very, very tight, I would say, internal relationship with the deep state and the war machine. And that's just an empirical fact, as near as I can tell. The greatest breakthroughs, for instance, in modern computing come from Intel in 1970 and 1971, the microprocessor and the storage chip. Now, Intel wasn't a defense project. However, the founders of Intel come out of Fairchild Electronics that built semiconductors for nuclear missiles. And this comes again and again and again. Now, and we see this. This came out very clearly with the Twitter files. It obviously hasn't ended, and goes back to actually Benji's situation with YouTube being an arm of the intelligence services. I mean, that's and the liberals won't talk about it, and the eco-socialists won't talk about it. And Kohei has nothing that resembles socialist politics. That's why liberals love Kohei. Because he doesn't talk about imperialism. He doesn't talk about class. He doesn't really have a conception of the economic history of capitalism and the dynamics of the centralization and concentration of capital. I could go on and on. But it's really quite striking that people are like, oh, yeah, like Marx was a degrowth communist. But, we're not going to talk about class struggle.
Yeah, it's an interesting Marx where that's taken out when, like, what are the opening words to the Communist Manifesto?
The history of all hitherto existing societies is that of class struggle. And the liberal Marxists always think that means class struggle in its phenomenal forms, in its surface forms. But of course, that's so not the point. It's the underlying dynamic. And, oh, by the way, as they point out, very clearly, I think, in the German ideology, the class struggle is always a socio-ecological, a metabolic process that involves natures that are both given and produced.
Yes, I think that's really been so revelatory for people thinking today, is reframing it. And maybe, Marx didn't keep hammering on about it, but it's obvious that this all rises out of a metabolic labor, human engagement as part of nature.
And Adnan, he's always pointing out that labor is a natural force, like again and again and again.
That's right.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, but that's a great point, because very often, when you're reading, in Capital Volume 1, and you're trying to think, what is this kind of, distinction that he's making about, labor. He talks about it essentially as a part of the natural forces, right? And then there's another stage of its kind of use in other kind of social dimensions. But that distinction is always like, well, but wait, aren't we just talking about laborers? No, because he is rooting it very closely with kind of natural forces. Yes, so so interesting. and Anli is looking forward to your response article to Saito. So I think that's going to be good. I wanted to kind of come back to a different coming back to maybe the contemporary politics of this a little bit, in our last like 20 minutes or so. And that is, how, if we recognize that environmentalism is essentially, a political project of a class that is trying to sees its demise and is trying to preserve itself. What kind of, and I think there's more to talk about. You've mentioned good science and how this ideology of this professional managerial class kind of authoritarianism and anti-democratic aspect sees this kind of equivalence between, that there should be an equivalence between good science, which already you've troubled as kind of consensus science rather than actually good science. Good science makes good policy, right? This is the problem, and also why and how democratic control can be written out of this equation, because it's only these experts who will really understand, the scientific experts, and then those who, can kind of work with the scientists to translate that into policy. That can't be something that's subject to democratic control. And so we're in a kind of political quandary here, where even so many of the concerns that people have in progressive left movements are actually contributing to their disempowerment in this in this way. So how can we have like a genuine politics that isn't a politics of fear, but what you've called ecologies of hope, right? So what's a politics that situates itself around an ecology of hope in your framework?
Well, I think it has to be organized around the fundamental premises of socialist and communist movements, of working class unity, and to take seriously Naomi Klein's observation about the climate politics, that this is a crisis of democracy. Now, Naomi Klein has a vision of socialism that's like Canada in 1974, and is completely fantastical. However, it's clear that the crisis of democracy is of liberal democracy, which was never very democratic, and the crisis of cheap nature and the crisis of accumulation are all of a piece. So they're all shaping each other, which explains in part why the main drivers towards a scientific dictatorship, in Huxley's turn of phrase, come from the liberal center, not from the far right. They're specific problems that have to do with the far right, but political space for them has been created by the extreme center, in Tariq Ali's nice turn of phrase. So this means, I think, first of all, confronting the profound NGOization of the Western left that some people are willing to talk about, but hardly any. It's a few folks like Aaron Good. You've had him on the podcast. My good friend and comrade Christian Parenti. He and I are working on a project to this degree, and to looking at the long-term history of the NGOization, the cultural Cold Warification, if you will, of the Western left, which of course was enabled by the destruction of labor movements, the soft power repression of the Western left from the 60s onward. And of course, also in the United States, the deep state executed RFK and Martin Luther King in 1968, along with Fred Hampton and many others. That there have been all of these forces to destroy the labor left and to ensure that there would be a mass basis for neoliberal woke politics around an alliance with the professional class. Now, because there was a grand bargain in the 1970s in the United States and some other places, but especially the United States, struck that the professional classes, the white collars, would get modestly rising lifetime earnings. They would have modest security of employment, and they would be cared for. and the rest of the working class, black and brown and every other color, would be absolutely pulverized, incarcerated, their towns destroyed, jobs shipped overseas, the most sort of extraordinary gutting of social and cultural life that now we see. Why is America such a hellscape today? Well, that's why. What put not just Trump into business, but also the Sanders phenomenon and into business after the great financial crisis. So all of these dynamics are in play, and I think that we have to be very, very serious about building a working class left that is serious about looking at a fundamental premise of the left in the 1970s, which is we have the best science that money can buy. And all of these academics, this, Adnan, all of a sudden discovered all of these bullshit science and technology studies thinkers, Latour and everyone else. Whereas in the 70s, we had amazing people like Richard Lewontin, Richard Levins, Robert Young, the Roses. I mean, these Marxist critics of science who understood that capitalism, A, has the best money science can buy and serves capital, not the people, but also that big science, all the way back to the scientific revolution, launders bourgeois ideology. And that's the connection with Malthusianism, natural law thinking, eugenics, everything else. It is to launder these ideological claims through science. So that means, here's a reason to be hopeful in the present moment. Just looking at the United States, the grand bargain with the professional managerial class is over, and they're being downsized. They're being thrown out left and right. You see it in labor unrest in North American universities, which is long overdue. The academics, generally speaking, are the most woke and liberal of the liberals, and oppose any genuinely working class movement. There are dissidents like you and I, but generally professors, like the rest of the professional class, hate the working class. I mean, I don't even think that that's contestable. Their whole universe is in abstract categories of virtue hoarding, as Catherine Liu underscores. So a working class movement has to confront these politics and also actually develop a political strategy after decades of failed horizontalism and politics, like we saw, like politics, non-politics, like coming out of Wall Street, Black Lives Matter. If we just hold an assembly, maybe the rich and powerful will decide to give up some of their riches and power. And we know that's not true. We know how the rich and powerful respond when they're challenged. And we have to be ready in the most sober ways to assess that threat and to assess the possibilities and to use our leverage, but not be naive about the tremendous forces of coercion from above. That's a tall order, but we're not going to get there by, telling ourselves fairy tales.
Yeah. I mean, I did find interesting that there is a sort of hopeful orientation that you have, in that you're quite convinced that there is genuinely a crisis of capitalism that has reached the end point of the cheapness, the economy of cheapness of labor and everything else, but principally labor. And the options there are limited. And we can see, the options that the ruling class is developing. So that gives us some sense of at least directions, not only what to oppose, but also, directions that might be built upon, for the future, because capitalism is either ending or transforming, or, whatever the typical relations that have been built around the exploitation of cheap nature, cheap labor, and so on, are ending, right? So that's
right. It gets more hopeful, though, because moments of very unfavorable climate, not just in the history of capitalism, but including that history, are bad for ruling classes. They are moments of profound political destabilization. There are many reasons for this, but chief among them is that bad climate means agrarian crisis. And agrarian crisis means class war in the countryside, and it also means expensive food in the cities, which is one of the key guarantors. Cheap food in the cities is one of the key guarantors of social peace. We know this, the history of the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, so on and so forth. So moments of very bad climate are indeed moments of hardship for the vast majority. But they're also moments of political possibility. And this is why we have to, on the left, we have to have a concept and a deep historical knowledge of how climate and class are intimately connected, not just in the history of capitalism, but all the way back. We can go to the 5th century in the Roman West. We can go to many other moments, the crisis of feudalism in the 14th century. And it shows this again and again and again. The ruling classes essentially begin civil wars and actual wars with each other. And the popular classes revolt.
A couple of things that have come up in the chat that I just want to bring to focus. Benji again asks what you might think of Kadri's concept of social nature. How does this relate to what you've been saying about the kind of turn to nature or using nature whenever there's a kind of crisis of the capitalist class?
It's been too long since I've looked at Kadri. I think that whenever we invoke nature, we need to be clear that this doesn't mean the web of life. Like when people love going camping or fishing or hunting or hiking or whatever it is, that's not getting back into nature. That's getting into webs of life. Nature is the specifically bourgeois invention of a separate domain of reality that can be, in some broad sense, managed. And this comes all the way from the 16th and 17th century to the present. So I've said nature is the most dangerous word. I firmly believe it. And modifying it becomes very, very difficult. So, it's not a semantic question. It goes back to Marx's formulation of historical materialism, and really his point of departure from the theses on Feuerbach and the manuscripts and everything else is a critique of abstract man versus abstract nature. And what do they put in its stead? It's what they've, as a soundbite, what they've called the labor theory of life. This is what Engels says when he says labor means when he says labor created man. So I think that whatever language we use, we want a practical consciousness of the centrality of labor in all dimensions of the human experience, and that labor doesn't determine everything, but it mediates what I call non-dialectical antagonism. So volcanic eruptions, the Earth's orbit around the sun, solar activity, minima, solar radiation, minima and maxima. Those are not dialectical events. They're non-dialectical events, but how societies, how class formations respond is a matter for dialectical inquiry.
Excellent. Yes, that's real materialism. And interestingly, we do have, like, maybe as a contrast, a question here: where does the indigenous earth perspective land in this context? And I'm not sure all the range of resonances, but there is a tendency, as part of that kind of neo-primitivist sort of kind of idea that, well, the problem is our kind of modern societies and civilization, not naming it only as capitalism, but capitalism is clearly a part of it, and kind of some sort of romantic, but also connected with the fact that resistance to a lot of the advance of, exploiting the, shrinking cheap nature and so forth is really the fault lines that deal with indigenous peoples and their resistance against, advancing kind of capitalist exploitation of land, nature, resources, labor, etc. So I'm wondering, maybe take this. I'm not sure exactly what Ode to John Trudell wants you to get.
It's great to hear John Trudell's name in any event. So John Trudell was a different kind of figure than a lot of this kind of woke romanticization of, the indigenous have a special connection to nature, and they have, there's kind of fount of ecological wisdom that circulates widely across the academy and middle class society, broadly construed. And it's unfortunately, a lot of that actually goes back to the history of colonialism and the myth of the ecological Indian. the indigenous peoples are closer to nature. Yeah, they were savages in the view of the imperialists, so they could be kicked off the land. This is the Lockean project from the 17th century, specifically in the Anglosphere. So, of course, there are innumerable contributions from indigenous thinkers to a socialist vision of planetary transformation and the construction of a socialism in the web of life. No question about it. I just don't like the endless romanticization and reification of indigenous any more than any other people. I mean, last time I checked in British Columbia, yeah, you have, for instance, many people organizing heroic and long-term struggles against fossil fuel corporations, but you also have a lot of indigenous peoples working for those corporations. That's not a morality play. That's capitalism. And what does that tell us? It tells us that these questions are really class questions. Yes, they are inflected and expressed in specific ways for indigenous peoples. The other part, Adnan, that I know you know is that this is translated into a kind of woke neo-Malthusian politics around land politics. And there's a reason why Marxists were profoundly skeptical and critical of peasantries historically, because, peasantries could and did support fascists, like in Eastern Europe in the 1930s. So say what you will about the communists who came later, but they made sure that it wasn't fascist and that, there was an egalitarian society. This means that it's so much of what we're seeing, and the environmentalist thread is a big part of this. It's not the whole story. So much of what we're seeing is what Michael Parenti used to call anything but class leftism. And then ignoring that then opens the gate to, I think, class reductionists and class formalists. And sometimes there's name calling from the liberals or the left liberals, and I see a lot of that, and it's not deserved. But other times it is deserved. So in eco-socialist thought, I mean, a comrade of mine, Matt Huber, wrote a very nice book called The Climate Crisis is Class War, something to that effect. But if you look at his conception of class, it's a completely formalist conception of class. It thinks that the working class is wage workers, when in fact the majority of the working class now and like forever have not been wage workers. And Marx, even in Capital, refers to sharecroppers in France as proletarians. He refers to slaves as proletarians, and so on and so forth. So I think the utter degradation on the left, the Western left, of class analysis and understanding class dynamics, and especially the anti-imperialist tradition of class critique. You mentioned Wallerstein at the very beginning. There was a Marxist Wallerstein and there was a liberal Wallerstein. And when Wallerstein was a Marxist in the 70s, you can look at how he developed an anti-imperialist and feminist class analysis, wholly consistent with the socialist forces in the third world at the time. Everybody ignores that. His friends ignore it. His enemies ignore it. And we have to have a class analysis that is appropriate to capitalism, which means putting together not just paid work and unpaid work. I've spent a lifetime historicizing this, that the pedestal of wage labor is socially necessary, unpaid work, but also in a metaphorical way that every proletarian moment also has a biotarian moment, also has a femitarian moment, and not as separate categories, but I use the language of moments deliberately so that we can get out of systems thinking, we can get out of formalism, and we can start to put them together. And until and unless we have an environmentalist politics that puts labor at the center, it will be a politics of authoritarianism.
Wow, that is a wonderful kind of summative statement. What I want to say just very briefly about, that indigeneity kind of question is that look at the Cochabamba, declaration. Mm-hmm. Now that's, indigenous response to the ravages of capitalism, demanding what Max Eil calls the People's Green New Deal, as opposed to the environmentalism of the rich that you've been talking about, and the way in which it is endorsed, every COP, every Earth Day, every, so on, official kind of, event that's perfectly comfortable doing land acknowledgements about the land that's been stolen with no kind of politics around, its restoration. So that's the divide. It seems to me that's really the divide. But what I want to say, just by way of concluding here, is to thank you so much for your work and the way that you've expressed it and shared it today, that brings together, absolutely rigorous materialist analysis of the environment, of historical materialism, together with anti-imperialist politics, and of course class analysis. I mean, that is just a rare combination, and one of the reasons why I'm so glad to have you on the program is that very few people, can bring together those different components into a global integrated kind of analysis, which is exactly what I think we need at this moment. And so I think we've just scratched the surface of some other key issues by taking the frame of environmentalism that is very much a presentist kind of politics and political concern in our moment. I'd love to have you back on some other time to talk more about, say, the 16th century, and the kind of emergence, the kind of analysis that you bring about the emergence of capitalism that really thinks about it in a different way than a lot of other world systems or global historians or, Marxists do. So I want to thank you again, Jason. It's been just such a pleasure, to have you on. And I'm absolutely positive that judging by the comments, that the, listeners and watchers of this have been benefiting enormously from this conversation and from your remarks and insights.
Thank you so much. It's an honor. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, Adnan. And the comments were amazing. So keep building this incredible community, because this is what we need. We need these spaces on the left to engage in these creative syntheses like you're talking about, that are heterodox and so urgent and so desperately needed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, hopefully you'll be able to come on again sometime in the near future. I really appreciate it. And your endorsement and remarks of encouragement. Takes a lot of work to keep doing these things. I like to read before, so I hadn't seen the Ecologies of Hope piece. So that was great. That's a recent from 2024. Everyone should go to your website to keep up with your voluminous and absolutely indispensable, scholarly production. So it's Jason W. Moore, Moore.com. And I think everything that you're doing gets listed, even if it's not available for download there. At least the references are there.
No, it's all there. It's all there. Go there. It's one-stop shopping. If it's done, if it's ready, it's up there. So
that's fantastic. So everybody should go there. They should also read. I had a question that came up in the chat that they were really appreciating your remarks. They said, "What should I read?" There's a lot to read of your work. But I always, and in fact, I actually really want to. I'm potentially going to teach the world history course in the future, and I really plan on using History of the World in 7 Cheap Things as a crucial resource for students. It's so well written, it's so clear, and it does exactly what this conversation has been doing, of bringing different threads of analysis together: colonialism, imperialism, the emergence of exploitation of labor in a new way in this mode of production, and racial regimes that are absolutely necessary for colonialism and imperialism all together. And that's, as I was saying, is rare. So I recommend that book to everybody. You wrote it with Raj Patel, and it's absolutely a wonderful resource. Anybody could pick it up and immediately have their perspective on world history be transformed. So I want to thank you for that work, and I want to recommend it to all of our listeners and watchers. This has been an Office Hours that I've really enjoyed and benefited from. Office Hours 11. Please, before you go, if you haven't already done so, share it, especially now. Even if they can't join the conversation that we've been having in the comments, they can watch it back and learn that way. So share it on social media. And we hope to see you again next week. Actually, we have a Halloween special next week. My friend, Marxist literary and pop cultural scholar David Schmid from a different SUNY Buffalo, will be joining us to talk about horror, fact, and fiction in an age of genocide. And so that should be a spooky, kind of discussion there. So we hope we'll see you next week on Halloween, on the 31st. But until that time, be well, peace with justice and solidarity to you all.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.